Hey everyone, welcome back. Looks like you've been getting into some seriously heavy economic theory lately.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So today we're going to do a deep dive into something that might sound a bit scary at first, deflation. Ever heard that saying, too much of a good thing can be bad?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, deflation might just be the perfect example of that. You sent over some really interesting articles and research papers on this. I'm actually pretty excited to unpack it all with our expert here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Uh-huh.
It's a really interesting topic to really get into because it kind of makes you question what you think you know, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to see prices going down?
Right.
But as you said, it's not always as simple as it sounds on the surface.
Exactly. And the research that you sent over really suggests that deflation can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it means your money goes further, you can buy more things with the same amount of cash, but then things start to get a little bit complicated.
Yeah. The real danger with deflation is what economists call a deflationary spiral. Imagine this. You're thinking about buying a new car, but you know that prices are going down. Makes sense to wait a few months, right?
Yeah.
You could get a better deal.
Yeah, I totally do that.
The problem is if everyone starts thinking like that, demand just falls off a cliff. Businesses, they end up with all this unsold stuff, so they have to cut prices even more.
Ouch. That's got to hurt.
It does. Their profits shrink, and then they might even have to let some people go.
Yeah.
And suddenly people have even less money to spend, which weakens demand even more.
Right.
And it just becomes a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it sounds like this good thing can turn bad pretty quickly. The source material also mentioned something about how deflation increases how much debt you owe.
Oh, yeah.
Can you explain that?
This is where it gets really interesting, and it all comes down to the real value of money. When prices fall, the money that you borrowed in the past is suddenly worth more.
Wait, how does that work?
Okay, so let's say you took out a loan a couple years ago to buy a house. Back then, prices were higher, so that loan represented a certain amount of buying power, right?
Right.
But now with deflation, you still owe the same amount of money, but it buys you less stuff.
Oh.
It's like your debt has grown even though you haven't borrowed any more money.
Wow, that's like a sneaky way for debt to become a bigger problem. It's like a hidden cost of deflation.
Exactly. And that can have a ripple effect across the whole economy.
Right.
Think about businesses that borrowed money to invest in new equipment or expand. Deflation hits, and suddenly their debt is way bigger, making it way harder to stay in business.
So we've got this potential deflationary spiral where people put off spending, businesses are having a tough time, and debt is harder and harder to manage. Now, the source material also mentioned another really important concept: inflation. It even said that deflation and inflation are two sides of the same coin.
Interesting.
Can you help us understand the key differences between the two?
Sure. It's super important to understand the difference. Because inflation and deflation both change prices, but they happen for totally different reasons and have totally different results.
Okay, I'm listening.
Deflation is when prices are falling.
Okay.
This can happen because of a few things like a drop in demand or too much supply or even a strong currency. But inflation, that means prices are going up. This usually happens because of things like increased demand, higher production costs, or sometimes even government policies.
Okay, so both involve prices changing, but for totally different reasons.
Exactly. And those differences make a big difference in how we feel them.
Right.
With deflation, your money is worth more. You can buy more stuff. But remember, we talked about the downsides, that deflationary spiral, and how debt becomes a bigger problem. Now, inflation, on the other hand, your money is worth less. You can buy less stuff.
Right.
But it can also sometimes be a sign of a healthy economy that's growing.
It's like two sides of the same coin, both with their own problems. And speaking of problems, the source mentioned that Japan has been struggling with deflation for a long time,
Yeah.
like decades.
Japan's experience is a really interesting case study. They've been dealing with deflationary pressure for decades, and it's been a real uphill battle to get their economy growing steadily again.
So then the question is, if deflation gets out of control, what can governments and central banks do to fight back? The source mentions something called monetary and fiscal policies.
Right.
Can you walk us through how those work?
Great question. These are the two big tools that policymakers can use to deal with deflation. Monetary policy is actions taken by the country's central bank, like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S. One of their main tools is changing interest rates.
Okay.
By lowering interest rates, they make it cheaper for businesses and people to borrow money, and that can encourage people to spend and invest more.
So lower interest rates kind of get the economy moving,
Exactly. Another tool they have is something called quantitative easing, or QE. It's a bit more complicated, but basically the central bank just pumps money directly into the economy by buying assets like government bonds.
So it's like pumping money into the system to try and get things going again.
Yeah, that's the general idea. The goal is to get more money out there and encourage lending and investment, hopefully pushing prices back up.
Okay, I get it. Now, what about fiscal policy? What's that like?
Fiscal policy is all about the government's spending and taxing.
Yep.
When dealing with deflation, the government can try to boost demand by spending more money themselves. For example, on infrastructure projects like roads and bridges. This creates jobs and puts money directly into the economy.
So it's like jump-starting the economy.
Exactly. Another option is to cut taxes, giving people and businesses more money to spend or invest.
Okay, so we've got these two sets of tools, monetary policy from the central bank and fiscal policy from the government. It sounds like it's really tricky to figure out the right combination.
It definitely is. And whether these policies actually work really depends on what's going on with the economy. There's no easy answer.
Right.
One-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah. So we've got a pretty good handle on like the nuts and bolts of deflation, I think.
Okay.
But I'm kind of curious about how it affects people, like psychologically. You know, the research you sent over talked about the psychological impact of deflation on consumers.
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting how deflation can kind of mess with our heads. When prices are dropping, it's natural to wait to buy things, like we were saying before about that car. You know, waiting could mean getting a better deal, but that wait and see kind of thinking can spread and actually make the deflationary spiral worse.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Sure.
People think prices are going to keep dropping so they don't spend money, which weakens demand even more.
Exactly. And this hesitation to spend can affect entire industries.
Right.
Think about things that last a long time, like appliances, electronics, furniture. People might just put off buying those forever if they think prices are going to keep falling.
Ouch, that can't be good for those businesses.
It's definitely not. Companies might have to offer bigger and bigger discounts just to get rid of their inventory. And that really hurts their profits. And it could even lead to them having to lay people off.
So deflation can be a real problem for businesses and the whole economy. But the source material also talked about a possible good thing about deflation, more savings.
Right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it goes back to how the value of money changes during deflation. As prices fall, your money is worth more over time.
Right.
So holding on to cash seems smart.
Yeah, I can see that. If everything's getting cheaper, why not wait to buy it?
Exactly. And that can lead to people saving more money across the board. Now, for one person, saving more money is usually a good thing.
Right.
Gives you some security, helps you plan for the future.
But there's got to be a downside here, right? Like if everyone starts hoarding cash, wouldn't that be bad for the economy?
You got it. Here's the weird thing. While saving more money sounds good, it can actually slow down the economy in the long run.
Right. Really?
Here's why. Investment and innovation. They need money to happen.
Okay.
If everyone's just keeping all their money in savings accounts, it's not going to new businesses, research new ideas, or other things that make the economy grow.
So saving too much can actually make the economy stall. It's like a delicate balancing act, huh?
It is. And it shows how complicated things are between how people act trends in the economy and government policies.
Now, we talked about Japan's experience with deflation earlier. The source material mentioned that they've tried some pretty unusual things to try to stop it. Can you go into more detail about that?
Japan's situation is fascinating. They've tried everything to fight deflation, using a mix of really aggressive monetary policy, government spending, and even changing how their economy works. They've even made interest rates negative.
Wow.
Meaning people actually have to pay to keep their money in some bank accounts.
That's crazy. So they're basically doing whatever it takes to get people to spend money instead of saving it.
Exactly. They've also pumped tons of yen into the economy through quantitative easing, hoping to encourage lending and investment.
Has it worked?
It's kind of a mixed bag. They've managed to avoid a total economic collapse. But Japan's economy has been growing really slowly for years. It's a cautionary tale, showing just how hard it can be to deal with deflation.
It definitely shows you need to have a lot of different approaches.
Yeah.
And be really careful about how you handle each situation. This whole conversation has really changed how I thought about deflation. I started out thinking lower prices sounds awesome, but now I see it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
With hidden problems and costs.
Yeah, that's what's so great about really digging into these topics. It makes you think critically and question what you thought you knew.
So for someone listening to all of this, What would you say is the most important thing to remember about deflation?
I think the key takeaway is that deflation is a really powerful force. It can be good and bad. While lower prices might seem great at first, you have to understand what it could mean for businesses and the economy as a whole. Deflation can create this downward spiral of less demand, falling profits, and more debt.
That's a good point.
Mm.
It's all about realizing how complicated it is and looking at it from all sides. And I think that leads perfectly into the next big question. Okay, so we've talked about how deflation affects demand. But what about workers? How does deflation affect them? The research hinted that it could be bad for workers.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's something people don't always think about. When there's deflation, businesses are always being pushed to lower prices. To keep making money, they often have to cut costs. And one of the biggest costs for most companies is labor.
So even though people's money might go further when they're buying groceries or clothes, their paychecks could actually be getting smaller.
Exactly, it's a tough situation. And this can create a bad cycle, where lower wages lead to people spending less money, which weakens demand even more and makes the deflationary spiral worse.
Wow, it's crazy how all these different parts of the economy are connected.
It really is, and it shows how important it is for people to make smart decisions, both for the people in charge trying to guide the economy and for regular people managing their own money.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into deflation, what's the one thing you want our listener to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that deflation is complicated. It can be good and bad. While lower prices might seem great at first, it's really important to understand the potential downsides and to look at it from different angles.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that economics isn't just about theories and numbers.
Yeah.
It's about real people and how these things affect our lives. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dives into deflation. I hope you found this exploration helpful and interesting. Remember, the more we know about these economic forces, the better we can understand the world around us. Until next time, keep those brains working and keep those questions coming.